Some stories entertain you, but some stories stay with you. If this one made you feel something, that's not by accident.
I have to find them. We're almost there.
Hold on. We're almost there.
Every season's particular cruelty, every stone wall that needed bracing before the winter storms. He was 43 years old, built lean and deliberate by decades of mountain work, and he had not done an impulsive thing in years. He had made his peace with that. Impulse, in his experience, was what got men buried young in this country, so he still could not explain what happened that August morning out on the Blackwood Trail north of his property line when he saw the girl. She was on foot. That was the first thing he registered. On foot and moving fast along the trail's northern edge, staying close to the timberline where the ancient pines grew thick enough to offer shadow. She was Inuit. That was clear from 20 yards. Young, perhaps 17 or 18, wearing a heavy hide parka and carrying a small wrapped bundle held tight against her side. Her boots were cut from the same hide as the parka, and they were worn thin at the heel. She moved with purpose, with the specific economy of someone who had been walking for a long time and intended to walk considerably longer. But there was something else in the way she moved. Something taut. Kaelen pulled up his horse and looked past her down the trail. The dust cloud was maybe half a mile back. 3 horses moving hard. He looked at the girl again. She had not stopped, had not looked up at him, was continuing along the timberline as if he weren't there at all. And that told him something in itself, because ignoring a man on horseback when you are on foot in open country is either foolishness or discipline, and she did not look like a foolish person. Kaelen sat on his horse for a moment and thought about a great many things very quickly. He thought about his homestead, which was 4 miles west and in no need of extra trouble. He thought about the 3 riders behind her, who could be anything from hired guns to a family search party, to men who did not require any particular reason to chase a young Inuit woman down a trail. He thought about the fact that the dust cloud was closing fast, and she was not going to make the ridgeline to the north before it reached her. And then he did something that surprised him completely. He swung down off his horse. The girl stopped. She turned and looked at him with dark level eyes that contained no fear and no particular trust either, just a measuring attention, clear and unreadable as still water. He held the reins out toward her without speaking. She looked at the horse, then at him, then back at the dust cloud on the trail behind her. She took the reins. She did not say anything. She mounted in one smooth motion, adjusting the bundle under her arm, and she looked at him one more time. Her expression had not changed, but something in it had shifted, a thing so slight he might have imagined it. Then she turned the horse east away from the trail into the broken country between the pine stands, and she rode. Kaelen stood in the middle of the trail and watched her go. Then he turned and watched the dust cloud get closer. 3 riders pulled up short when they saw him standing there alone. They were white men, roughly dressed with the particular look of men who were being paid to be unpleasant. The one in front had a red bandana around his neck and eyes that moved fast and inventoried everything. "You see an Inuit girl come through here?" he asked, not bothering with a greeting. Kaelen looked up at him steadily. "I've been standing here about 5 minutes," he said. "Haven't seen much of anything." The man looked at his boots, looked at the fresh hoof prints in the dust, which told an obvious story. Looked at Kaelen, who was standing in the middle of a trail without a horse. "Those your tracks?" the man said. "Could be," Kaelen said. The man's jaw tightened. He looked at his companions, then back at Kaelen. He was working something out, whether the situation was worth pushing, and what it would cost him to push it with a man who was standing still in open ground with both hands visible and not a flicker of concern on his face. The calculation took a few seconds and came out the way these calculations usually come out when one side is patient and the other side is in a hurry. "Keep moving," the man said to his companions. They rode east at a different angle away from the direction the girl had gone, and Kaelen watched them until the trail curved and they disappeared. Then he started walking. It was 4 miles back to his homestead, and the sun was already climbing, and he had work to do that was not going to do itself. He walked it in just under 2 hours, hat pulled low, moving at the unhurried pace of a man who has accepted the situation and is simply dealing with it. His farmhand Elias was at the gate when he came through, leading a horse by the bridle to the water trough, and he stopped dead when he saw Kaelen coming up the track on foot. "Where's your horse?" Elias said. "I lent it," Kaelen said. Elias looked at him for a long moment. "To who?" "Somebody who needed it more than I did this morning." Elias was a quiet man with a practical face and 17 years of mountain work behind him, which was enough years to have learned that asking Kaelen Vance the same question twice was usually not productive. He handed over the horse he was leading, a brown mare used mostly for fence work, and went back to what he had been doing without another word. Kaelen took the mare into the barn, put her in her stall, and stood in the cool, dark for a minute with his hand on the rail. He thought about the girl's face when she took the reins, the way she had looked at him before she rode. He could not read what it had meant, and he had learned enough over the years to know that he probably was not supposed to. Some things communicated clearly across the distance between two people's experiences, and some things did not. And the gap between a 43-year-old mountain man from the Appalachians and a young Inuit woman riding hard through Sierra country was not a gap that closed itself in 4 seconds of eye contact. What he knew was this: she had needed his horse, and he had given it to her, and she had taken it. That was the whole of it. What happened next was not something he could control or particularly anticipate. He went back to his fence line. If you're following this story so far, go ahead and hit that like. It helps more than you might think, and it keeps these stories coming your way. The next 3 days passed without incident. Kaelen worked his cattle up on the north pasture and spent an afternoon patching a section of roof that had been letting in rain since spring, and he had his usual weekly conversation with Elias about the fence line along the eastern boundary, which was always in worse shape than either of them wanted it to be. His other hand, a younger man named Jude, who had been with him 2 seasons, asked once about the missing horse, and Kaelen told him the same thing he had told Elias, and Jude nodded and did not bring it up again. On the evening of the 4th day, Kaelen was on the porch with his coffee when Elias came up from the barn at a pace that was slightly faster than usual. "You got company," Elias said. East Ridge. Kaelen looked. The light was going gold and long across the scrubland, and on the ridge that ran along the eastern edge of his property. There were shapes that had not been there an hour ago. He counted 5, then 7, then more, as he looked carefully. A line of riders along the ridge, still as the rock itself, watching the homestead. "Inuit?" he asked. "Northern tribe, I'd guess," Elias said. "By the horses." Kaelen sat down his coffee. He thought about getting his rifle. He decided against it for the same reason he had decided against it 4 days ago with the riders on the trail. Reaching for a gun when someone is watching you from a ridge is a message, and he was not ready to send a message yet when he did not fully understand the conversation. "Let's wait," he said. They waited. The riders on the ridge did not move. The light faded slowly, the way it does in that country, reluctant, and when the last of it was gone, the ridge was empty again. Kaelen stayed on the porch a while longer, looking east in the dark. Then he went inside. At first light, he found his horse at the gate. The animal was in excellent condition, better, if he was being honest, than when he had handed it over. Its coat had been brushed, its hooves cleaned, and someone had replaced the worn leather on the stirrup strap with a new piece that was a good deal better quality than what had been there before. Tied to the saddle horn was a small bundle wrapped in cured hide. Inside the bundle was a piece of dried venison, a handful of pinon nuts, and a length of beadwork, blue and white, on a thin leather cord. The beadwork was precise and intricate, the kind of work that takes time and intention. Kaelen stood holding it in the early light for a long moment. He put the venison and the nuts in his coat pocket and carried the beadwork inside and set it on the table where he could look at it while he drank his coffee. He did not know exactly what it meant, but he had spent enough years in this part of the country to understand that it meant something, and that the something was deliberate. He went about his morning. 2 days later, a rider appeared on the trail coming in from the east. Not from the ridge this time, but from the main trail, approaching openly at a walk. Kaelen was at the corral, and he watched the rider come in without moving toward his rifle. As the rider got closer, he could see it was a young man, Inuit, perhaps 20 years old, riding a pinto mare with an easy confidence. He stopped at the gate and looked at Kaelen. "You are the man from the trail," he said. His English was careful, deliberate. "I am," Kaelen said. "My name is Siku," the young man said. "I was sent to speak with you." Kaelen opened the gate. He could not have said entirely why, only that the young man's manner contained something he recognized. That same quality of patience that had been in the girl's eyes, the composure of someone who had already decided exactly how much they were willing to risk and was not afraid of it. "Come in," Kaelen said. "I'll put on coffee." Siku dismounted and tied his horse at the post and followed Kaelen into the cabin without looking around at the place the way people sometimes do when they are nervous or calculating. He sat at the table where Kaelen gestured and accepted the coffee when it was offered, and held the tin cup the way anyone holds a hot cup on a cool morning. Kaelen sat across from him and waited. "The woman you helped on the trail," Siku said. "Her name is Anaya. She is the daughter of our elder." He paused, watching Kaelen's face. "The men who followed her, they were hired by a man named Silas Thorne. He has been buying land in this valley for 2 years. Buying it or taking it." He paused again. "He wants the corridor between your land and our hunting grounds. He needs both to control the water." Kaelen was quiet for a moment. "I know who Thorne is," he said. And he did. Silas Thorne had appeared in the territory about 3 years ago with money from somewhere east, and an easy, expansive manner that made men trust him before they understood him. He had acquired 3 homesteads in the past 18 months, 2 of them from families who had been in the valley longer than Kaelen. Both times there had been talk of pressure applied, fences cut, cattle driven off, a well poisoned once, though that had never been proven. He had sent 2 men to talk to Kaelen about purchasing his land the previous spring, and Kaelen had sent them back the way they came. He sent men to track Anaya, Siku continued. She was returning from the northern springs. She had been there alone, a thing she does. Our elder had not known she went. He glanced at his coffee. She told us what happened on the trail, what you did. He looked up at Kaelen directly. She said you gave your horse without being asked and without asking anything in return. That's about right, Kaelen said. Siku nodded. Our elder sends a message, he said. He says a debt was made and the horse has been returned, but there is more. He set down his cup. Thorn's men have been watching your land. The same men from the trail and others. We have seen them on the South Ridge 2 nights this week. They are not watching to learn your habits. They already know your habits. He let that settle. Our elder believes they will move against your land within the week. He believes they intend to drive you out the way they drove out the others. Kaelen looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked at Siku. Your elder sent you here to warn me? Yes. Why? Siku seemed to consider the question as if it were more complicated than it looked. Then he said, because Anaya asked him to, and because he says, a man who gives something freely without expecting a return is a man worth warning. Kaelen stood and went to the window. He looked out at his land, the corral, the barn, the north pasture stretching up toward the ridge, the creek line that ran along the western boundary. 15 years of work, 15 years of stone walls and dry summers, and the particular grinding patience that keeping land in this country required. He thought about the families who had sold to Thorn or claimed they had sold, and about the well that had been poisoned and never proven. There's more. He said it was not a question. Yes, Siku said. Your elder didn't just send a warning. Siku was quiet for a moment. He offers help, he said carefully. He says the corridor Thorn wants, your land is part of it. If Thorn takes your homestead, our access to the northern springs is gone. What threatens you also threatens us. He met Kaelen's eyes. He says, we are not the same. He knows that, but sometimes 2 people who are not the same are fighting the same enemy. Kaelen turned from the window. He looked at Siku for a long moment, reading the young man's face the way you read a stretch of country. Not looking for what you want to find, but for what is actually there. What was there was straightforwardness. No performance, no appeal. Just a man sitting at a table delivering a message with complete honesty about what was in it for both sides. Tell your elder I want to speak with him, Kaelen said. Siku nodded once. He finished his coffee, stood and picked up his hat. At the door he stopped. Anaya also said to tell you something, he said. Kaelen waited. She said to tell you that your horse has a loose shoe on the left front. She noticed it on the trail. It was reset before we returned him. He looked at Kaelen with something that might have been the edge of a smile. She wanted you to know she noticed. He walked out to his horse and rode back east without hurrying. And Kaelen stood in the doorway and watched him go, and thought about a girl who had been running for her life and had still noticed a loose shoe. If this story is speaking to you, subscribe to the channel right now. You won't want to miss what comes next. He told Elias that evening. Elias listened without interrupting, which was his way. And when Kaelen had finished, he was quiet for a long time. Thorn, Elias said. Thorn, Kaelen confirmed. You believe what the young man told you? I do. Elias looked out at the south ridge in the fading light. If they're watching us from down there, we've had company for 2 nights already and never knew it. 3 nights, Kaelen said. The Inuit have seen them 3 times. Elias made a sound in the back of his throat that contained a substantial amount of feeling. He was quiet again. Then the elder's offer. I'm going to accept it, Kaelen said. Elias nodded slowly. Jude won't like it. Jude doesn't have to like it. The men in town won't like it either. If word gets out. Word will get out, Kaelen said. It always does. Elias looked at him with the expression he got when he had more to say, and was deciding whether to say it. Then I've been on this land 11 years, Kaelen. I'll still be here in the morning. He stood up from the fence rail and stretched his back. I'll check the south ridge tonight. See if our guests left any tracks. He walked toward the barn, and Kaelen stood at the fence for a while after he was gone, watching the ridge line hold its shape against the darkening sky, thinking about what the next few days would look like and about whether he was ready for it. He had chosen this valley for its isolation, for the specific silence that comes from being far from the kind of noise that people generate when they want things from each other. He had not in 15 years regretted that choice, but isolation, he was coming to understand, was not a permanent condition. It was a delay. Sooner or later, the noise found you. And when it did, the only question that mattered was whether you knew what you stood for. He thought he did. The meeting with the elder happened the following morning at the eastern boundary of Kaelen's land, at the old dry creek bed that marked the edge of the property. Kaelen rode out alone. Siku was there waiting, and beside him an older man on a gray horse, compact, deliberate, with silver threading his hair and eyes that had the same quality of stillness as Anaya's, but deeper, more settled. The stillness of someone who has been carrying a great deal for a very long time. Kaelen dismounted, and the elder dismounted, and they stood facing each other across 10 feet of pale, cracked earth. The elder spoke. Siku translated. He says you gave something freely to someone you did not know. He asks if you understood what it would cost you. Kaelen considered that. Not entirely, he said honestly. I understood it was a risk. I didn't know yet how much of one. Siku translated. The elder listened, then spoke again. He says a man who does the right thing knowing it is a risk is worth more than a man who waits until the risk is gone. He says many men wait for the risk to be gone. It never is. Kaelen looked at the older man. He's right about that, he said. A long pause, and then the elder spoke at length, and Siku translated carefully, piece by piece. He says Thorn is not simply a man who wants land. He is a man who understands that water is power in this country, and that if you control the corridor between the mountains and the valley floor, you control who lives and who leaves. He has done this before in other places. He knows what resistance looks like, and he plans around it. The men he has watching your homestead are not here to frighten you. They already know you are not easily frightened. They are here to count your hands and your horses and your ammunition and your fences, because when Thorn moves, he does not move until he knows the arithmetic favors him. Kaelen let that settle. So we changed the arithmetic, he said. Siku translated. The elder nodded, and for the first time something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but a loosening. He says yes, Siku said. That is exactly it. They spent the next hour at the dry creek bed working through what they each knew. The positions where Thorn's men had been seen, the likely approaches to the homestead, the water sources that Thorn would try to cut off first. The elder knew this country the way Kaelen knew his own kitchen. And what he laid out was not a plan built from anger or urgency, but from the kind of knowledge that accrues over generations of living in a specific landscape. He knew where men could hide and where they could not. He knew which approaches could be watched and which could not. He knew things about the South Ridge that Kaelen had never thought to learn. Kaelen listened. He asked questions when he had them. The elder answered them fully, without the kind of strategic withholding that Kaelen would have expected from a man who had every reason to trust him only so far. There was something about that openness that Kaelen found after a while almost disorienting, because it asked something of him in return. You cannot receive complete honesty and offer half measures. The conversation would not allow it. He offered complete honesty back about how many men he had, about his ammunition, about the stone wall on the south that had been weak for a year, about the fact that he had no particular allies in town who would ride out to help him if things went badly, because he had spent 15 years making sure he had no debts and few obligations, and that had served him well until now. The elder listened to all of this. When Kaelen was done, he spoke briefly. Siku translated. He says, you have been making yourself small in order to be left alone. He says, Thorn does not leave small things alone. He says sometimes the only way to protect what is yours is to make yourself bigger. Kaelen stood with that for a moment. Then he said, tell him I think he's right. That night, there was movement on the South Ridge that Elias spotted from the barn roof just after midnight. 2 figures moving along the ridgeline, slow and deliberate, carrying something. They moved east and disappeared. In the morning, there was no sign of anyone, but the wall along the south pasture had been breached in 2 places. Clean work, the kind you make when you want to test how fast a man repairs things. They repaired it by midday. That evening, Elias found boot prints near the water tank behind the barn. Kaelen sent word to Siku. The response came back the following morning. Thorn would move within 2 days. His men had been seen gathering at a dry camp 6 miles south, 8 riders, well armed with 2 additional men who had the look of former soldiers. They would come at night, and they would come to destroy rather than to negotiate. Fences, barn, water tank, forcing Kaelen off the land without the complication of direct violence, the same method that had worked on the 2 homesteads before his. Kaelen read the message and thought about the homesteader named Clifton, who had sold his land to Thorn the previous spring and moved his family north. Clifton had been here 12 years. Good man, good land. He had never said exactly what had happened. He had just packed his family up one day in April and ridden out, and when people asked, he said he had decided to move on. Kaelen had not pushed. He wished now that he had. He spent that day and the next preparing. Siku came himself the second afternoon with 4 men, and they moved through the homestead together, and Kaelen watched how they worked. Quiet, efficient, reading the terrain the way soldiers read a battlefield, which in a sense is exactly what it was. They knew things about positioning and sightlines and the psychology of night approaches that no amount of ranching experience would have given Kaelen, and he was honest enough with himself to recognize it and learn from it without the discomfort that some men in his position might have felt. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There are more stories like this one coming, and every one of them is worth being there for. On the second night they came, Kaelen heard them before he saw them. The particular quality of silence that is not silence at all, but the absence of the night, sounds that should be there. The insects and the small rustlings and the distant call of a hawk. When those sounds go quiet, it means something large is moving through the dark, and something large that is moving carefully is worth paying attention to. He was already at the barn door with Elias beside him when the first shape appeared on the south wall. 8 riders moving at a walk. No torches yet, but he could see the shapes of what they were carrying. Cans, he thought, and rope, and the long shapes of rifles slung across backs. They spread out as they approached the homestead, taking up positions that told him they had looked at the layout of this place carefully and knew where the vulnerable points were. What they did not know was that the layout had changed. Over the past 2 days, quietly and without drama, the homestead had been rearranged in small but significant ways. The horses moved to a different enclosure, the water tank shielded, specific positions prepared along the wall and behind the stone wall of the root cellar. And on the ridges above, in positions that Thorne's men had no way of knowing to account for, there were Inuit riders who had been in place since sundown, and who were at this moment watching everything with the patience of people who have been doing this kind of work for generations. Kaelen stepped out from the barn door into the open. He was not a dramatic man, and he did not feel dramatic at that moment. He felt clear, which is a different thing. The specific clarity that comes when you have thought through a situation long enough that it no longer frightens you, when you understand it well enough to act rather than react. "I know who sent you," he said at a volume that carried across the dark yard. "I know his name, and I know what he's been doing in this valley, and I know how he did it to the Clifton place and the Hendersons before that." He paused. "I also know that right now on both ridges above this homestead, there are people who have been watching your approach for the last hour. They know your positions and your numbers and what you're carrying." Another pause. "So I want you to think carefully about what you're being paid for tonight versus what it's going to actually cost you." Silence. One of the riders in the middle of the line spoke. His voice was low and controlled. "You're bluffing." Kaelen did not answer. He looked up at the south ridge. There was a moment of complete stillness, and then a fire was lit. Small, controlled, a signal that lasted perhaps 4 seconds before it was snuffed out. Then another on the north ridge. Same thing. Then, a sound rolled down from the east. Not a shout, but a single clear note, the kind that carries meaning in it the way a word does, even when you don't speak the language. The riders' horses began to move, not in any orchestrated way, but the way horses move when they become aware that they are not in a place that is safe for them. A shifting and pulling that communicates itself immediately to men in the saddle. The man in the middle said something quietly to the men around him. Kaelen did not hear what it was. He did not need to. They turned their horses and went back the way they came, at a walk that was not quite a retreat and not quite dignified, but was definitively a leaving. Kaelen watched them go until the dark took them. Elias let out a long breath beside him. Jude, who was behind them near the barn wall, said something under his breath that Kaelen chose not to hear. When the south wall was empty again, Kaelen looked up at the ridge. He could not see anything, only the dark and the stars and the quiet. But they were there. He went inside and made coffee because it was too late to sleep, and he was not tired in any case. He sat at the table and looked at the beadwork piece that was still there where he had left it days ago. And he thought about Silas Thorne, who was going to be a problem tomorrow and the day after that, and probably for some time to come. You did not simply outmaneuver a man like Thorne in a single night and have that be the end of it. Men like Thorne had lawyers and town officials and the particular resilience of people who are powered by money rather than by anything more perishable. This night had bought time, and it had changed the arithmetic. It had not solved the problem. But it was a different kind of problem now, the kind you solve over time rather than the kind that solves you. Anaya came to the homestead for the first time 2 mornings later. She came with Siku openly, just riding up the main trail in the morning light the way any visitor might. Kaelen was at the gate. She looked different from the woman on the trail, not physically. Still the same precise angular face, the same steady eyes. But the specific tautness was gone, replaced by something more settled. She dismounted and stood at the gate and looked at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything, which was fine, because they had, in some ways, been in conversation since that August morning, and some things had already been established between them without a single word ever being spoken directly. "The shoe held," she said. He looked at her. "The one that was reset," she said with something at the edge of her voice that might have been humor. "I wondered if we did it right. I am better with bows than with horseshoes." "It held," Kaelen said. Better than the original. She looked at the homestead, taking it in the way her father had apparently done from a distance, reading it for what it was, what it said about the person who kept it. Then she looked back at him. "My father wants you to know," she said, "that what you did on the trail, it was not expected. Men have let us pass through this valley for years without trouble, but no man has ever given anything of his own." She paused, choosing the next words carefully. "He says a debt cannot be fully repaid in one action. He says he intends to repay it over time in ways that will be useful to you. And he says if Thorn moves against you again, we will know before you do, because we know this valley in ways that Thorn's hired men never will." Kaelen thought about what to say to that and settled on honesty. "Tell your father I am grateful," he said, "and tell him that what I did on the trail I would do it again, not for any return, just because it was the right thing to do." Anaya looked at him. Something moved in her face. Not softness exactly. She was not a soft person, and that was one of the things he already knew about her. But a recognition, the look of someone who has found something they did not know they were looking for. "He will not be surprised to hear that," she said quietly. "That is why he trusts you." She stayed for an hour that morning. They sat on the porch, and Siku sat at the edge of the steps, and there was coffee, and the kind of conversation that moves slowly and covers real ground, about the valley, about the water, about Thorn, and what might be done through legitimate means, which Kaelen knew more about than she did, and about the land itself, and what it needed, which she knew in ways he was only beginning to understand. She came back the following week, and the week after that. It would be a long time before Silas Thorn was finally removed from the picture. That story involved a land surveyor from the Territory Office, a set of documents that turned out to be forged, and a particular winter when 3 separate families who had sold to Thorn under duress came forward together, which is a story worth its own telling. But the valley changed before any of that. It changed in the small ways that real change always begins. A water line managed differently. A trail used by 2 peoples who had once moved past each other in silence. A gate left open instead of shut. A man who had spent 15 years making himself small, deciding that he was done with that. Kaelen Vance never made a speech about any of it. It was not in his nature. He nailed the elder's marker to his gatepost one afternoon without ceremony and went back to his work. And when Elias saw it and Jude asked what it meant, he said it meant that people passing through were welcome to water their horses at the trough, which was true as far as it went. What it meant in full was more complicated and took longer to say. It meant that one morning in August, a man had surprised himself by doing something right. It meant that the girl he had handed his horse to had noticed a loose shoe, even while she was running for her life. It meant that her father had read a piece of land from a distance and found in it the character of the man who kept it. It meant that 2 peoples who had every reason the world could supply to pass each other in silence had instead sat down at a table and talked about water. In the end, that was what it had all come down to. Water. The simplest, most necessary thing. The thing that no wall and no deed and no hired man on a ridge could make belong to any one person. Because in that dry country, under that enormous sky, water was life itself, and life did not negotiate. You either shared it or you lost it. He shared it, and in doing so, he found something he had not known he was missing. The particular richness of a life lived alongside people who saw the same land differently than he did, who knew things about it that he did not, who brought to the shared problem of survival a wisdom built from centuries of living exactly where he had chosen to live for 15 years. That wisdom was not his, but it was available to him if he was willing to listen. And the willingness to listen, he came to understand, was the whole of it. That was the thing that separated the men in this valley, who made it through the hard years, from the men who did not. Anaya told him once late in the second autumn after everything had changed that her grandmother had seen it in his land before she ever saw it in him. That the land of a man who pays attention looks different from the land of a man who does not. That the way a wall is kept, the way a creek bank is managed, the way a gate hangs on its post, these things are a language, and her grandmother had always been able to read it. He thought about that for a long time, about being read without knowing it, about a woman he had never met, who had spent 2 days studying his homestead from a distance and decided, based on the evidence of how he lived, that he was worth approaching. It was one of the stranger forms of respect he had ever been paid, and he carried it with him, the way you carry something that has no shape, but has weight. He learned more of the valley's language as the years went on. He was a slow student, as he was a slow student in most things, but he was thorough. He learned it the way you learn a landscape, one stretch at a time, with patience, with the understanding that you will be learning it your whole life and never fully finish. That was all right. He had time. The valley held them both, and it was large enough, and the water ran clear. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that the simplest act of decency can change the shape of a life, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments. Would you have handed over your horse that morning? What would you have done? We read every single response, and your thoughts mean more to this channel than you know.
Some stories entertain you, but some stories stay with you. If this one made you feel something, that's not by accident.